Hey, what's up, Bush Kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today, we're going to be talking about military conflict in the Civil War. We have two learning objectives for today. Our first one is 5I, explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War, and 5J, explain how Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War impacted American ideals over the course of the war. So first, just a little bit of review from last time. So when Lincoln was elected in 1860, 7 southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. That's the Deep South. The first shots of the war are going to be fired at Fort Sumter by Confederate soldiers, which leads to 4 more southern states seceding in 1861. Lincoln calls for 300,000 military volunteers to preserve the Union. Remember, not to end slavery. So the nation is now divided, right? We've got the North versus the South. And do remember we have those border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and that other one. All right, slave states that stay in. Now that leads us then to key idea number 1 for today. And it says both the Union and the Confederacy mobilized their economies and societies to wage the war even while facing considerable home front opposition. So we want to look at how they mobilized, and we're going to look at advantages and disadvantages as the war kind of began. And so after the outbreak of the Civil War, the North had a lot of advantages. All right, if we just kind of look at the chart kind of at the bottom, we can see some of the advantages the North had. For instance, they had more farmland than the South did. Even though the South was mostly agrarian, all right, it's not like you can really kind of eat cotton. You know, I know Joy thinks that you can, but you can't eat cotton, very well. All right. They had a larger population. They had more railroad tracks, which is good for transportation. They had more factories. All of these are major things. But the North also had some major challenges in the war. All right. They had to actually invade the South to win. And it would be really difficult to maintain enthusiasm and support for this war over a long period of time. And they generally, their plan in general that they came up with was called the Anaconda Plan. All right, the Anaconda Plan was the North's strategy for victory in this war. And it's going to influence what they do and how they do it over the next several years. And the Anaconda Plan maximized the North's industrial advantage, but it did require better leadership than the North had at the time. And it included things such as blockading the coast, seizing the Mississippi River to divide the South, and taking the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. Here's another way to look at it. Now, although outnumbered and less industrial, the Confederacy also had some advantages as well. For instance, President Jefferson Davis knew that the Confederacy didn't have to actually win the war. They had to fight this war in many ways like the Americans had and Washington had fought the Revolutionary War. As long as they dragged the war out, all right, they could make the North quit. As long as they made the war expensive enough, they could make the North want to quit. And so the Confederacy strategy was an offensive-defensive strategy, meaning that they would protect Southern territory from Northern aggression. And they would attack into Union territory when opportunities presented itself. But generally, they would be on the defensive. The other major part of their strategy was to attempt to get foreign support, to get either Britain and France to join their cause. And a lot of this, they relied on this idea of King Cotton, the importance of this Southern staple that's being sent to places in Europe, sent to France, sent to England, that's driving textile production in those countries. And so those countries would need to maintain their supply of cotton. Therefore, they would help to support Southern independence. But as long as they could drag the war out, they could hopefully make the North quit and win. Another major advantage that the South had was in terms of their leadership. They had much better military leadership, epitomized by people like the man you see on the left-hand side there, Robert E. Lee, who's going to be the commander eventually of the Army of Northern Virginia. He is going to be the best general on the battlefield until the end of the war, when Ulysses S. Grant shows that he is just as good as he is. He also has better lieutenant generals with him, including a guy named Stonewall Jackson, who becomes Lee's right-hand man. Now, during the war, political leadership is also going to be very important. For the North, it's going to be President Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln will face domestic challenges. Now, the North is not united entirely behind the war. Certainly not like the South is. The South is much more united behind this conflict. And there's many people in the North that are against the war. And there's many that speak out against the war. Now, Lincoln, during the war, is going to use his emergency powers to protect national security. And so to do this, one of the things he does is he suspends what's called habeas corpus. Habeas corpus are laws requiring evidence before a citizen can be jailed. And what he does is he uses these laws to arrest and imprison without a trial, without a court date, without arranging bail, groups of people, many of them called Copperheads. These were Northerners who were against the war, people that wanted to just let the South go. And what Lincoln said, and what the government was saying at the time, was that these people were stirring up controversy in the North, damaging the war effort, and they couldn't do this. And this brings up an important debate that we have many times throughout U.S. history, is this debate between our freedom and our liberties and between national security. It's a debate that we're having now. For instance, our freedom to have privacy, like online privacy, versus our nation's ability to try and combat terrorism. Or during World War II, when we had to combat national security versus the rights of Japanese Americans. You know, it's this delicate balance especially during times of crisis. And so Lincoln does suspend this. He suspends habeas corpus. Many people are locked up and spend quite a bit of time in jail. Additionally, he shuts down newspapers that don't support the war. And these all seem like things that go directly against, things like freedom of the press, general freedoms, freedom of speech that are all protected by our First Amendment. But once again, emergency powers protecting national security in times of crisis, ladies and gentlemen, we lose rights. Now, on the other hand, in the South, the political leadership was led by Jefferson Davis. He also had a really, really difficult time. The Confederacy's Constitution protected states' rights. Governors could refuse to send troops or money, and oftentimes they did. Georgia refused to send troops to the front many times, and the currency of the Confederacy inflated 7,000%. It basically became worthless. In terms of both their armies, though, both national governments of both the USA and the Confederacy relied on volunteer armies in the beginning, but soon then switched to conscription or drafts to supply their armies with troops. Which leads us to key idea number 2. Although the Confederacy showed military initiative and daring early in the war, the Union ultimately succeeded due to improvements in leadership and strategy, key victories, greater resources, and wartime destruction of the South's infrastructure. So let's kind of get into the fighting. Now, we've talked about kind of the lead up to the war. We talked about the first shots. Let's get into the actual battles themselves. So between 1861 and 1865 as the war goes on, but the war is generally divided into two halves. You can kind of see the timeline at the bottom right there. Between 1861 to mid-1863, the Confederate Army was winning the Civil War. The defensive strategy carried out by superior Southern generals like Lee and Jackson, and disagreements among military and political leaders in the North are going to cause a lot of problems for the Union. So we've got the map right here, and you're going to see some kind of battles pop up, and notice how the timeline moves across the bottom. We're not going to hit every single battle. There's a lot more, and there's some cool videos, other videos that are out there that go through all the different battles. If you get the chance to visit some of these places, they're really cool. And the first major battle of the war is the Battle of Bull Run. It's also known as the Battle of Manassas and happens in early 1861. This is the first major battle of the war. Now, don't get this confused with the first shots of the war, which are fired at Fort Sumter. This is the first major battle. And the hero of this battle is, Stonewall Jackson. He gets his nickname Stonewall at this battle, and he keeps the Union Army from taking the Confederate capital at Richmond. Now, the reason why this battle has two names is that the North named battles after the nearest river. The nearest river was called Bull Run Creek, which ran through the middle of the battlefield, where the Confederacy would name the battles after the nearest town, and the nearest town was Manassas, Virginia, which was very close. There's some interesting stories about this battle. For instance, people from Washington, D.C. came out with picnic baskets to watch the battle, and Southern artillerists, not being very used to their weapons, actually fired cannonballs into their midst. The Confederacy won this battle, and you can tell that they won because I outlined the entire thing in red. I'll outline Union victories in blue in the next few slides. But big outcome from this battle is not only did the Confederates win it, but it also makes everybody realize two things. Number one, that the war is going to be a lot bloodier than they thought. And number two, the war is going to be a lot harder than anybody thought. Everybody thought that there was going to be this one battle and that was going to be it. And now after this, everybody realizes that this thing's going to go on for a little bit longer. Now, in the West, the Union is a lot more successful. In 1862, they win the battle at Shiloh, which is in Tennessee. Also in 1862, the Union is able to capture the port of New Orleans. So they're very, very successful out West. But in the same year, in 1862, the Confederacy also wins the battle at Seven Pines. And they're able to win a battle right outside of Richmond called the Battle of the 7 Days in 1862. And then they follow that up with another victory, what's called Second Bull Run as well. So generally, by the end of 1862, between 1861 and 1862, the Confederacy had success in the East. But the North, the U.S., had success in the West. Now, one of the big kind of turning point battles, though, is going to happen right at the end of 1862. And this is going to be called the Battle of Antietam. Now, after Second Bull Run, Lee sees an opportunity to invade the North. And this is happening for him. He sees this opportunity for two reasons. Number one, it is harvest time in the South, and he wants to draw Union armies away from southern fields so that Southern planters can harvest their crops so that they can feed that army for the next coming year. But additionally, he also has seen an opportunity after winning this battle at Bull Run. If he can invade the North and have a successful battle in the North, he can make many northern states want to quit. And that's what they want to be able to do. That's the whole plan. They're not trying to conquer the North. They're just trying to get the North to quit. So if they can win a major battle there, they can make that happen. The problem is, though, is that the Union finds Lee's marching plans, his battle plans, wrapped up in a couple cigars that they find on the Bull Run battlefield. And so General McClellan, who had up to this point been the inept commander of the Northern Army, is able to get the jump on Robert E. Lee. And they fight this major battle at Antietam Creek. All right. And so this becomes a huge, huge battle. It is, by the way, the single bloodiest day of battle in the entire Civil War. It's a one-day battle. It's incredibly bloody. Tens of thousands of people are injured and fall on both sides. The Antietam Creek literally runs red with blood by the end of the day. But McClellan, even though he knows where Lee is, he knows where his troops are, can get the jump on them, McClellan is inept, and the battle ends without a clear winner. But this battle has some important effects on the North. Number one, the battle is going to convince Britain and France not to support the Confederacy in the war. And number two, the battle is going to convince Lincoln that the time was right to make the emancipation of slaves the new focus of the war for the North. So let's just kind of go back, right? So I showed you that quote in the last video. In the last video, we talked about Lincoln's view toward slavery. He said that if he could win the war by freeing all the slaves, he'd do it. If he could, win the war by freeing none, that he would do it. If he could win the war by freeing some and leaving others in slavery, he would do that as well. The whole purpose of the war was to just reunite the Union. But now, after following the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln's going to decide to move forward with announcing emancipation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was justified as a military necessity. It declared that slaves were freed in rebel territories, but, all caps here, does not free slaves in the border states. So what he's doing is he's freeing some slaves, but leaving others in bondage. Now, why is this important? Number one, it strengthens the moral cause of the war. Now this war is moving from a war not just against secession. It's not just a war, like Lincoln said, a year before, as about just reuniting the Union. Now it's becoming against slavery. Number two, it helps keeping Europe from aiding the Confederacy. Many European nations had moved against slavery. They had become emancipationist nations. And so if we make the war against slavery, to help the South would mean that they're aiding slavery, and they can't do that. And it gives the Union new soldiers for the Union Army. All right, it opens up the ability for African Americans now to serve in the military, and eventually nearly 200,000 will, which is important. It does have some limits. North had no authority in the Confederacy, so all those slaves that were freed in the Confederacy aren't really freed. And it does not apply to the border states, because Lincoln doesn't want to lose those. All right, he's worried that the border states will be kind of mad about that, so he doesn't want to lose the border states, so it does not include them. Now, 1862, though, will come to a close with the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is a major Confederate victory just to the south of Washington, D.C. They'll then follow that up with another victory in the east at Chancellorsville in 1863, another Confederate victory mostly. However, the Confederates, although they win, Stonewall Jackson is killed during the battle. And this is a major blow to the Confederacy. Lee says he has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm. Your right-hand man's the person that you rely on. And so when Lee loses Jackson, who's actually shot accidentally by his own troops, has to have his left arm amputated, but he dies later from wounds and from an infection, which was very common at that time. Lee loses one of his best men. So generally speaking, although after Antietam, the Confederates continue to win in the East, we are going to see some major changes about to happen. So, between 1861 and 1863, despite being outnumbered and under-equipped, the Confederacy will dominate the fighting in the East due to better generals and a better defensive strategy. However, by mid-1863, the weight of the northern population and industrial capacity starts to turn the tide in favor of the Union. However, the Union does have success in the West with the leadership of General Grant. So let's go to the second half of the war. 1863, the turning of the tide. So by 1863, the Confederacy was having difficulty sustaining the fight. Attempts to lure Britain and France to the war had failed, thanks to things like the Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union blockade, which is part of the Anaconda Plan, is going to limit Southern manufacturing. The lack of grain fields leads Southern soldiers to be ill-equipped. Joy, cotton's not very good for you. All right. And to pay for the war, Confederate printed money, leading to massive inflation and economic problems. So there's going to be two battles here that are going to be really the turning point in 1863 that we have to talk about. All right. So the first one is going to be the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg happens immediately after the Battle of Chancellorsville. So after Chancellorsville, Lee wins. His right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson's killed. And then Lee, once again in late 1863, decides to invade into Pennsylvania. Once again, two reasons: getting Union soldiers away from Southern fields, but two, trying to win that Northern victory again to be able to end the war. However, at Gettysburg, Lee is finally defeated. It's the first time that Lee's been defeated up to this point. And so the battle at Gettysburg proves to be the turning point of the war. Lee's halted, and the Confederates never are again able to attack in Union soil, and the Union Army begins to win the war. Now, an additional piece of notes here that you need, all right, is that there's a key geographic element to the Battle of Gettysburg. And one of those key geographic elements is control of the high ground. At Gettysburg, the Union soldiers were able to control the high ground. Therefore, they were able to win this particular battle. Now, the battle at Gettysburg ends on July the 3rd. All right. And on the same day that the Battle of Gettysburg happens, the last part of the Battle of Gettysburg, it was a 3-day battle, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. The end of Vicksburg also happens. Now, Vicksburg is another important battle. All right. Vicksburg had been the last holdout of the Confederates along the Mississippi. Union soldiers had been working both from the south northward and from the north southward, led by General Ulysses S. Grant. And the last holdout on the Mississippi was the city of Vicksburg. By being able to capture Vicksburg, which falls as well on July the 3rd, the same day as the last day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union Army is able to cut the Mississippi River, and they divide the South into two halves. As a result of this, the Confederacy becomes weaker, and Ulysses S. Grant is promoted to lead the entire Union Army. He heads east then to go face off against Robert E. Lee, who he will eventually defeat. Now, after the Battle of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the tide of the war has turned. But at Gettysburg itself, this horrific battle that we have over 50,000 casualties in, Lincoln goes up there to commemorate a cemetery a few weeks later. And there he gives one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history, the Gettysburg Address. Now, the Gettysburg Address is incredibly important for a few reasons. In his first part, the 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This defines those principles that our government was founded on. The second part of the speech, where he talks about being engaged in this great Civil War, he talks about how the Civil War is to test to see if the principles that we talked about in the first paragraph would last, because other republics had failed. And then he ends with this very important part where he says that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth. This idea that the Union needed the Civil War to preserve the form of government. And so what Lincoln is able to do is Lincoln is able to redefine the war. All right. He had believed in the preservation of the United States was the most important task for the U.S. president. And although he did not believe that the southern states had the right to secede from the Union, he thought that they were just rebelling against the government. And what we see is that from the beginning to where he is now, the purpose of the war has changed. In 1862, the purpose of the war was to protect the Union. And now the purpose of the war is to end slavery and to make sure that we have this quote-unquote new birth of freedom. Very, very important how we are redefining the war with Lincoln as things go on. Now, under Grant's leadership, the Union Army is more aggressive and committed to destroying the South's will to fight. He's going to appoint William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the Southern campaign, and Sherman is going to lead that Southern campaign and destroy everything of value in the South and emancipate slaves during his march to the sea. Now, Sherman is going to view total war as necessary to defeat the South. Starting from Chattanooga, he marches south along basically what is I-75 today, coming literally right through our backyards, fighting at the Battle of Dallas, then at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, eventually destroying Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta was a huge victory for the Union because it took out a major Southern Railroad terminus. It was also incredibly important to the election of 1864. In that year, Lincoln faced a tough re-election campaign against George McClellan. And the North's war failures were a key election issue in that particular year. When Atlanta fell during Sherman's march to the sea, Lincoln is overwhelmingly elected. After being reelected, he gives another important speech, another important event in Lincoln's tenure as president, and that's his second inaugural address. When he delivered his second inaugural address, Union victory over the Confederacy was certain, and Americans foresaw the end to slavery. Instead of boasting about the victory, Lincoln expressed sorrow that the states had not been able to resolve their differences peacefully. However, he clearly stated that slavery was such an evil that the North was right to have gone to war over the issue. Nevertheless, he urged Americans not to seek revenge on slaveholders and their supporters in military. Instead, he urged reconstruction of the South with, quote, malice towards none and charity for all. In this way, he would set up the years after the Civil War in a time period that we would call Reconstruction. With the South crumbling, Lee will batter Well, Lee will be battered by General Ulysses S. Grant through a period of battles called the 40 Days, and eventually surrounded, or nearly surrounded, at Richmond and Petersburg. Lee will be able to escape his entrenchments there, but not get too far. His battered and bruised army, numbering only a few thousand left, is finally defeated one last time at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. After a short skirmish there, Lee decides to surrender his army. On April 9, 1865, Lee will surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, ending the fighting in the Civil War. If you go there, you can see the room that he was able to surrender in. There's a couple paintings of that particular room. So in conclusion, from 1863 to 1865, the lack of Southern resources and unity, as well as the Northern advances into the South, leads to the end of the Civil War. However, the war does have some tragedy at the end. It was short-lived. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln will be shot by the Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln, in many ways, is the last casualty of the Civil War. The Civil War had some pretty profound effects. There was over 600,000 troops dead, more than any other war. Over 1 million people are injured as a result of the war. But there's also some major social changes as well. The 13th Amendment is ratified before the final end of the war in 1865, ending slavery. The war forever ends the states' rights argument. No longer do states have the right to secede from the Union. The South is destroyed, and a plan was going to be needed to both reconstruct the South physically, but also socially as well, and to admit states back into the Union. Well, that's all that we have for today. Over the next few lectures, we'll talk about that reconstruction of the South and how that's going to take place. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And until next time, go Pack.